Since the late 2010s, in very real terms, China had been the dominant, undisputed world superpower by real facts, figures, capabilities, attributes, assets, and more. And this was due to a whole slew of various factors, many of which already mentioned throughout the entirety of this entire documentary series. As everything utilized in not only the Battle of Austin, but all other battles occurring are all very real technologies, capabilities, weapons, and more. The Chinese being the dominant world superpower and leader of the entire coalition, with Russia also a major coalition leader and partner with them, had divvied up North America, and either nation alone had the capabilities of crushing militarily America, but both combined were simply invincible, as it were. As China alone was already so freakishly gargantuan in their industrial base, their aggregate of stored and active weapons and munitions and ammunition types for their active reserves, ready reserves, and even their freakishly massive paramilitary forces, which were all combat trained and armed. These forces made up the vast majority of the coalition forces on the battlefield, as this was China's project to take the lower 48, which they already had rump Canada. They'd already controlled that and had used that as part of the springboard for their external components that were moving south into America, as the rest of their external components were moving north from Mexico and battering ramming their way in, fighting their initial battles before taking the rest of the time to race up the key invasion routes that had to be secured by Trojan Shock forces, along with many other objectives that they were tasked with achieving. As Austin, as a battlefield, was no less important than many of the other battles occurring, although it wasn't anywhere near the size of the fighting occurring to the north undertaken by the PLA and Russian army forces of the 2nd Combined Arms Army that were also present there, like their heaviest maneuver elements like the 16th Tank Division and 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, although they had other maneuver elements that were present in San Antonio, and of course one committed in Austin as well. The fighting in Fort Hood was simply of a scale and size that Austin didn't even compare with. Although Austin, again, was no less important, as this was the home of the state regime, as well as the command center of the state's military forces, being their National Guard of the Army and Air Force present at Camp Mabry, as mentioned before, as the Chinese 68th PLA Group Army was concerning itself with the destruction of the large American active duty Army forces of 3 Corps that were present on Fort Hood, which were active duty Army forces, as well as capturing Waco, which was also seen as important. Chinese paramilitary forces were also, besides the Russian and Chinese army forces that were north of them, fighting in Fort Hood, fighting over Austin as it pertained to the Chinese paramilitary troops of the People's Armed Police 43rd Brigade and their 130th Artillery Regiment, which was equipped exclusively with all their firing battalions and their comprising batteries, armed with the Type 59-Roman numeral I, or 1, howitzers, which were a mid-range caliber between lighter artillery howitzer calibers like 105 and 122 millimeter calibers, used by different nations, as well as also heavier calibers like 152 and 155, and of course the monstrous 203 millimeter caliber. These were still light enough and mobile enough and easy to set up enough for the People's Armed Police doctrines that these highly effective weapons, when utilized in high concentration, even the lighter 122 millimeter howitzers could be as well, when fired in high concentration, were very destructive and very capable at supporting their forces as they operated in the field of battle throughout the entire campaign. As People's Armed Police shock forces would fight American Army forces and armed reactionary civilian forces, which they, by the way, excelled in because they crushed insurgencies back home every time any arose over the years in Xinjiang due to weapons being smuggled in and people trying to resist CCP rule. These forces would bring these skills to America, but become 10 times more harsh against the American people because they had bought many propaganda that were patently false because they were impossible in the first place, like that America could somehow put China through another century of humiliation or surround China. Patently false because it was impossible. China was far too powerful and massive for this, but nonetheless, the People's Armed Police believed this, which led them to commit some of the most heinous atrocities because the connection in their minds was also made with the American people supporting its regime and its foreign policy, which wasn't necessarily the truth, but this led to them gleefully carrying out the policies of the Heinrich Himmler of the East, known as Wei Fenghe, and his ambitions of cleansing and more, with the local population either being enslaved or annihilated in this brutal war of subjugation and extermination, such as this PAP platoon moving through an area here, using a victim as a road sign, as in Mandarin it says "this way," doing things with concertina wire and flame that just shouldn't be done to human beings, as well as also bayonet practice and creating heap victims, and of course burning down the nation with their Type 74 flamethrowers, which in and of themselves were terror weapons that were not just devastating against human flesh and buildings, but also even many types of vehicles as well. This man is drinking baijiu to drown out his guilt and inhibitions, if he even felt any. Wars were hellish and brought out the worst in human nature, no matter who or what side it was. As the People's Armed Police were a savagely brutal and fanatical pro-CCP regime element, their Praetorian Guard, their equivalent of the Waffen-SS, albeit in modern times, they would carry out the will of the party to the letter. And leaders like Wei Fenghe would see their dreams come to pass through the actions of forces such as these. Other Chinese armed forces, whether they're active duty military elements or their other paramilitary forces, were nowhere near as vitriolic and hateful. They were much more humane, although they bent the Geneva Conventions, even the Russians did and others. they never outright broke them like the paramilitary forces would, like the People's Armed Police and the IRGC, who also had a bone to pick with the Americans for all the perceived injustices done to Iran over the years by America, like assassination campaigns and Operation Praying Mantis and other affronts to the Iranian regime, which would cause their forces, like the 44th Pozdoran Brigade here in Oklahoma, to act out violently as well against the locals who resisted them, much like the People's Armed Police did. They found any excuse possible to take out their hatred on the locals, and did so with glee. As the invasion kicked off and the coalition air power came in heavy and hard, the very powerful Su-34s of the earmarked Su-34 squadron from the VVS just for this battle space alone in Austin had come in after first the PLAAF fighter squadron of their JF-17Bs earmarked for this battle space that were conducting the air superiority role and limited close air support if needed, while the Russians were conducting the vast majority of the pre-prepared strike operations as well as close air support themselves, as they carried a phenomenal payload per aircraft. Even as mighty as the JH-7 was that the Chinese PLAAF possessed, and it was very powerful at carrying almost 20,000 square pounds of payload, this aircraft, the Su-34, could carry slightly more, at 26,000 pounds per aircraft. In other words, the 12-aircraft squadron, in effect, carried just over 300,000 pounds of air-dropped or fired ordnance, or a combination of both. As the JH-7 in a full 12-aircraft squadron could, in effect, carry over 200,000 pounds. Although, with the Su-34s operating in this area, they had an enormous quantity of targets with which they were entrusted with destroying, as the real-time battlefield AI data processing network of the Chinese and also the Russians had already pre-prepared all the strike packages, as the cyber warfare arms of China predominantly, but also even Russia, had ascertained all of the relevant intelligence gathering operations by hacking into all the financial transaction records from landowners that were having land leased from them by the state and federal regimes for forward operating bases and combat outposts, as well as urban parking areas and urban buildings and hotels as well, like rental agreements for hotel rooms. All of this was used to send artillery firing missions in pre-packaged by the AI to the FDCs of the artillery firing platoons and gun lines, batteries, in effect, as well as also to the aircraft that would be conducting air strikes, or in some cases even whole strategic air raids when it pertained to heavy strategic bomber aircraft, as well as also missile forces firing cruise and tactical ballistic missiles, or even the container-based cruise missiles that would begin to fire their first salvos at 2 a.m., like the Russian Club Ks, or their Caliber cruise missile systems that were container-disguised, or the Chinese YJ-18C container-disguised cruise missile system equivalents that China had. And these would all be taking out all of their assigned targets. As Camp Mabry was the headquarters in the number 8 building predominantly of the Texas military forces of their National Guard, namely their Air and Army Guard forces. These were fully staffed at this time in these buildings, namely the number 8 building and other ancillary buildings, by the command staff forces of the National Guard elements pertaining to the Air and Army Guard, as they were trying to come up with defensive planning and operations for their forces that they had just mobilized and where to exactly send them, as not all forces that were already bivouacked had been given orders of critical infrastructure to defend. There was a local reserve battalion, the 1st of the 355th, which in fact was a training battalion that had been mobilized with the purpose of defending the Austin-Bergstrom International Airport. Although they left a skeleton crew at their headquarters in Round Rock, an outer northern suburb of Austin, although Georgetown was yet another one even north of there. The headquarters of the 1st of the 355th would be overran immediately and also hit by heavy artillery and even missile strikes from Chinese missile forces at the same time by the PAP artillery and maneuver elements of the 43rd PAP, or their mechanized infantry forces, as one of their battalions would strike this area, as well as clearing armed reactionary civilians off the flanks as they fought military forces in the headquarters that was also being struck by cruise missiles and hit by artillery from their own artillery forces of their Type 59-I or -1 howitzers, their 130 millimeter howitzers. At the same time, other forces would be conducting flank clearance operations of other armed reactionary civilians elsewhere, like this mechanized infantry battalion, with rocket fire support from their BM-21 Grad battalion firing 122 millimeter rocket salvos to annihilate clusters of armed civilians that simply emerged from their homes with weapons in hands and were perceived as a threat. The Russians simply annihilated them with rocket fire, and this was simply a mopping up formality, sending in these forces, as for the most part, after the rockets had been fired on these forces, most of them were annihilated, and all that was really left to do was just to go in and clean up anything that had survived, if anything even did. This combat engineer battalion would lay a PMP pontoon bridge, a Russian pontoon bridge, over the Colorado River and Lake Travis area here where Lake Wei was, and effectively use it as its own crossing point that it controlled and commanded for its own forces, as many of the bridges spanning the Colorado River would all be destroyed as a precautionary effort, in other words, like had been done in other battles that was going on simultaneously to this by other missile forces, or even by the same Chinese missile forces in some cases, as river crossings were perceived to be important to the American defending forces and thus should be highly regulated, and if not, outright destroyed, as very few would be left intact, like here, and those in the downtown area predominantly, as this was technically part of downtown. For the most part, the downtown bridges would be left intact because of their close proximity to what was to become the mega fob of the Austin-Bergstrom International Airport, not to mention, of course, there would be another sub-fob of the Austin Municipal Airport, and yet another fob in Lago Vista of the Rusty Allen Municipal Airport, which would be taken over and expanded by the Russian combat engineering forces once it had been captured, mostly intact. As the air power brought to bear, even by just 2 squadrons of aircraft, a Su-34 squadron from the VBS and the fighter squadron of JF-17Bs from the PLAAF in this area, were more than enough in terms of air power within this small 20 by 20 mile area. When it came to the air power, this was a small area for so many aircraft, to outright annihilate any and all challenges from anything that appeared on the ground to challenge the maneuver elements. As 30,000 troops between the Chinese and Russians of their 207th Motor Rifle Division, plus the 2 battalions that were in the area on CCP properties that were part of the 297th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, plus all the paramilitary forces of China from the PAP and their 1 battalion from the National Construction Corps, the 250th Construction Battalion from the National Construction and Production Corps in the long form. but National Construction Corps effectively. They, combined with the Russians, numbered about 30,000 troops. Now, this was more than enough troops needed to capture a city of over 1 million people when you're not concerned about civilian casualties, which clearly the People's Armed Police damn sure weren't concerned about. And the Russians, though they, for the most part, again, followed Geneva Conventions like the regular PLA Army troops did and other far more humane paramilitary forces of China did as well. The PAP did not give a rat's ass about the civilian population at all, and they were frequently given orders to massacre large groups of them or everything that moved. And the Russians, although they didn't outright annihilate whole civilian populations unless they were in the way, were not concerned about collateral damage. If they saw armed resistance and there were civilians that were dumb enough to be around it, then they deserved what they got, is what the Russians felt. So if they effectively, there were armed reactionary civilians in this area, but there were non-combatants near them, they did not care about those non-combatants because they chose to be in an area where there was armed resistance and battle occurring. So the crossfire did not concern them, nor did the artillery strike packages that came in atop of the armed reactionary civilians. And effectively, again, they had enough troops for a city and a metropolitan area of this size, again, because they did not care really about the civilian population, but the PAP more so than the Russians as it pertained to their lack of concern for the civilians. As the 2nd of the 198th would be attacked on two sides by half of this armored battalion of one of two Russian tank or armored battalions of their T-72B3Ms, comprising the 4 tank companies of the battalion, with 2 armored infantry companies, which were effectively mechanized infantry, but within the armored battalion, and also a BMPT Terminator company within the battalion of the anti-tank company, and of course their headquarters and support company, making the 7 combat companies and the 1 headquarters, the command and logistical company of the Russian armored battalion, would split up into halves. Half of them would go and surround and destroy this pocket of emerging armed reactionary civilians and a bunch of ranch properties to the slight northwest of the city of Round Rock, while the other half would race into the northern portions of Austin and fight alongside of the People's Armed Police to the south, as they would effectively begin almost 2 miles apart and squeeze and crush the 2nd of the 198th where they stood at their bivouac sites. As the Russians would be hurriedly moving in 4 companies, this would consist of 2 tank companies, their anti-tank company taking up the rear as a sort of rear echelon or rear security force, with their 2 tank companies and armored infantry company committed to the battle, taking up the front, going against the 2nd of the 198th here, with the other companies falling in behind them later after they had destroyed these armed reactionary civilians on the flanks before moving in and joining, falling in behind the rest of their battalion. While this People's Armed Police battalion that began inside of Austin city limits would effectively be attacking a grouping of armed reactionary civilians before going on down the line to clear downtown itself, after first committing 1 of their 7 combat companies inside of their battalion, along with, of course, their headquarters and support company, which was command and logistics. Their 1 of 7 combat companies would guard their rear flanks against the 2nd of the 198th, with heavy artillery support from 1 of 3 artillery firing battalions of the 130th Artillery Regiment. Of course, there was their independent headquarters and independent support companies of at the regimental level of the regiment of artillery, who were on the same CCP regime property as the headquarters battalion over the whole 43rd PAP Brigade. And this battalion racing in would commit 1 company, while the Russian battalion moving in committed essentially 4, or half of their battalion, to this fight. So there were 5 total coalition companies of combat elements against what effectively were 5 American companies, as Alpha Company was gone, which was its other tank company, leaving only Bravo Company. And as soon as the first shells began landing from People's Armed Police artillery fired from Pflugerville as this other battalion was firing into the area here, not hitting, of course, the highway, but near it, hitting armed reactionary civilians, as well as also other firing batteries firing to the south in Del Valle here. There was their 3rd Battalion of Artillery Forces firing off-map to support these 2 maneuver battalions from the 43rd, pressing away from this battlefield and moving out, securing the flanks of this whole operation off-map further to the east, nearly linking up again with the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, which was about 40 miles away from this battlefield, which was a 20 by 20 mile battlefield, 40 more miles away. As now we go to the map of this battle, Russian armor in this battle is coming in from the north on both sides of Interstate 35 here, as again, this is roughly a 2 mile north-south in total scale by 1 mile east-west battlefield. As to the slight south and west is actually the sports stadium and University of Texas campus in the city, and below that, to the south of that, is the State Cap building, wherein the regime leadership of the state regime is meeting currently at the opening of this campaign, of this invasion, and this battle in Austin, with the military leaders of the Texas National Guard, Air and Army. And the Russians and Chinese paramilitary forces were both interested in capturing the Cap building, as of course this would all become New China anyhow. The Russian flag and Chinese flags would all fly over that building upon it being captured by Russian forces, as the party flag of the CCP regime and its national flag of China would fly over that building with red banners draped over it, and of course the Russian flag planted atop it as well, as they would be the forces that captured it, as Russian combat engineers, like this example of a platoon of combat engineers with 2 more MTLBs behind this one right here, as that would make all 5 vehicles with their IFV, their BMP-3, like so here, firing its 100mm main gun at a target, IMR-3 with a heavy machine gun turret. Of course, each vehicle crew and dismounted squad has their own quadcopter asset, loitering munition, Lancet-3, supporting the forces moving in, running over trees in their path. These forces were heavily supported by the air and missile forces of China, as DH-10As were coming in from the Chinese missile forces in Mexico, slamming into and destroying these buildings, these 3 hotels lined up at the same time as Russian air power came in and dropped their GLONASS or satellite-guided KAB-500Ss, which were the GLONASS-guided 500-pound or 500 kilogram rather, which is 1,000 pounds or just over 1,000 pounds munitions, which destroyed all of these vehicles, including the headquarters platoon of Delta Company, which was taking up the rear flanks temporarily while Charlie was fleeing. Bravo had already gone ahead to scout the way ahead, only to run into Russian armor moving south from the north. Again, 2 tank companies backed up by armored infantry, 1 company, and of course the anti-tank company further behind them, taking up the rear flanks, guarding the forces that were advancing into this area into the south, while the most of the PAP forces of their combat forces from this battalion had raced into this area to destroy armed reactionary civilians, committing 1 company of their total of 7 combat companies, plus their headquarters and support company, to guard their rear flanks, as the rest of their forces were in the south, fighting armed reactionary civilians along I-35. Some were fleeing and being attacked by CH-901A loitering munitions fired by the combat drone section of the headquarters battalion of the 43rd PAP Brigade. This was the headquarters platoon, which is command and logistical elements of this combat company. These are the combat platoons that form the combat company with the headquarters platoon. The troops were moving up this street in 3 squads. This was a full platoon right here that came from these vehicles. This was a full platoon of dismounts that came from these vehicles that moved up into the area and were firing, exchanging fire with these American forces as this squad moved up this street to assist. Coming from there, these forces here, coming from these vehicles, they were moving up to assist this platoon before they were to turn and assist their forces moving into this area here with some of this platoon as well, as there were the 5 total squads of this platoon of vehicles, as they were leaving most of their vehicles further back, although one platoon was helping to destroy these American forces and moved in with their Bradley and M113s, which were the armor personnel carriers, the weakly armored but very light and nimble and fast M113s for military vehicles, and the Bradley IFVs with their 20mm autocannon, which was pretty powerful, and of course their tow missile pods here, like this cover had been moved up from to fire. And the Chinese vehicles with their very powerful upgunned 30mm autocannon on their IFV version, plus their heavy machine guns, W85 12.7mm heavy machine guns on the APCs, were supporting their troops, who were mutually supporting them from the rooftops of these still somewhat intact buildings, firing down at these American dismounted squads here, moving through this area. These belong to these forces here. And the artillery had been called in by their platoon-level drones and was precision-guided by the drones, radioing in the coordinates as they zipped through the area with loitering munitions set on AI target-seeking mode, again fired from their own combat drone forces, 48 at a time. Others had already slammed into targets before this map even opened up. These had already been destroyed before this map even opens up. As the map opens up, this is hitting right here, the artillery of one whole firing battery, just drenching this entire block with artillery shells. Artillery had already destroyed all this within the first 30 minutes of the invasion, and destroyed these vehicles within the first 30 minutes. These vehicles then moved in as the people raced out of the hotels to get into their vehicles and get them the hell out of this lot and out of these parking lots, as there were tanks and other vehicles in this parking lot behind these former hotels here, in this empty lot here, and in these hotel parking lots. And the Russian 2 pairs of Su-34 aircraft moving into the area dropped only 4 munitions each, which was anywhere near close to what they carried as a total payload. This was just their first pass. And they dropped these ordnances on the hotel and headquarters company vehicles, which spanned this lot, the front of the hotels here, and had been in this lot as well, but were destroyed. Charlie moving up the street. Delta was pulling a rear guard action, while Bravo was scouting ahead. They were the main battle tanks. They were the heaviest of the forces. They were trying to scout ahead because they were trying to get the hell out of there. They were trying to get the hell out of the bivouac site and move to somewhere more advantageous to fight from, as they lacked ISR capabilities and communications, again, due to the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes and electronic warfare assets north in the Fort Hood battle and south in the San Antonio battle, which both blanketed this area, not to mention all the aviation base that the PLAAF had on their heavy strategic bomber aircraft that was covering the area as well, as they had H-6K heavy strategic bombers operating north in the Fort Hood battle, which blanketed that area with enormous quantities of airdropped ordnance, which was utterly annihilating in total mass destruction. As the forces in this battle were now being sandwiched between Russian and Chinese forces, this mixed commercial, business, and housing areas, or housing neighborhoods beyond the map to the east and northeast here, and warehouses and small businesses here, and office buildings for tech companies and other places in this area here as you're getting closer towards downtown. This is North Austin. This is 2 miles. This parking garage here. This is all being struck as these vehicles try to pull out and get the hell out of the way as they see the munitions land and annihilate as they splash this whole area, cutting down all these troops that fled out of the hotels to get into their vehicles and get them spun up. This headquarters platoon of the Delta Company is destroyed outright by the airstrikes. PAP artillery lands and destroys these forces, but not after these forces were destroyed first, and these forces turn the corner and exchange brief fire with them as even the vehicles fired in an L vector of fire with PAP forces getting into this building from this platoon. They're firing down from the heights of this building. This building's actually a 5-floor building at this area here. It was about 3 floors down here. These 3 squads of this platoon of dismounts coming from these vehicles, 3 move into this building here, with 1 from this platoon moving into this building as well, with 2 going to the roof and 2 staying on the bottom floor, using their flamethrowers against this squad as it tries to bound across the street to basically get towards these buildings to kick in and try to fight over control of the buildings with these forces. The artillery slams destroys these forces, as it had already destroyed these dismounts with loitering munition strikes here, getting these dismounts as they tried to get into a fighting position with these others, and vehicles here getting destroyed by artillery fires, and fires coming from the roof-based troops, these 2 squads in line formations on the roof with the rest of this platoon behind the rubble safely. Although they had not been deployed yet, they could have been and would have done even more damage. As this vehicle tried to pull up from this platoon and deploy a squad into this, as this squatted hurriedly in this rolling T formation and this tactical formation to watch upper and lower floors of buildings, hurriedly cleared this and moved into this building, then to deploy force this building, had a flamethrower out. So, actively posted the M1 fire, burning out of control, and everybody inside was dead, but those following behind it were also being burned as well and being fired at out the window and from the side by this move fire missile at this missile, as well as also forces firing out the window from this squad from this building at these forces with flamethrower and anti-armor and anti-tank weapons. And at these forces as well, also loitering munitions support coming in, and hitting these armed reactionary civilian vehicles trying to haul ass up the highway this early on in the first hour. This battle was already 30 minutes in when this opens up, as these forces were getting into position, the PAP and the Russians coming down from the north. This apartment complex was being cleared by Russian armored infantry squads and others moving alongside the buildings as per building clearance SOP before moving across and leapfrogging to clear other buildings as these tanks move up. Although they knew the Americans were here first because they had ISR dominance, the Russians and Chinese, and could see the Americans long before the Americans could ever know that their enemy was near, because they could only see what was in front of them. And although their tanks had excellent optics, and they did get one shot in first, a fast enough shot because they had a very fast tank crew in this tank, the other tanks coming in returning fire. And again, urban warfare tank-on-tank combat can be difficult at times due to rubble piles and buildings in the way obstructing the tank gun and the optic fuse, but they only got one tank, and the rest of the tanks with Lancet 3 loitering munitions annihilated all of these American tanks. As these tanks tried to move up through the area, these 2 tanks moved through this area and fired on their flanks, destroying them as they saw them moving with their quadcopter assets, this tank as well. They already knew where they were before these tanks even got into position. Loitering munitions already took these out. These tanks were already taken out by the tanks going around this destroyed tank. Armored recovery from the headquarters platoon of this company came in and got this tank, pulled it out. The range of the Russian tank guns was phenomenal, and could hit with ATGMs the American tanks from a much further distance away. But even with standard heat shells or tungsten sabot ammunition or other ammunition types, they could hit the Americans at a fairly long range. Although they had to have no obstructions in the way to do it, they could do it. And they had destroyed these American tanks as they got into these positions, coming up under the highway, destroying them, because again, they did not want them anywhere near the highway. I-35 was the most vital invasion route in the entire nationwide invasion as it stood. And as PAP took these buildings and brief exchanges of fire went on with Americans, they had only lost a few troops to very limited fire from a Bradley in one instance, and also these troops trying to get up near the building and firing and wounding a few more. And they would exchange fire briefly with this squad and this squad here, and they would lose one more soldier. The PAP would only lose 2 troops and would have a handful of wounded. The Russians would lose 4 troops or actually 3, I'm sorry, because this tank crew only had a crew of 3. They would lose 3 troops in that crew, and they would lose 1 armored infantry soldier, making 4. As this tank went around and engaged these tanks, as these 2 tanks came around with armored infantry and engaged these tanks, and although the turret gunner was facing this direction and fired and clipped one of the Russian armored infantry troops, the tanks were annihilated, both these tanks, by the Russian tanks firing from this direction and this direction, outflanking them, while this one tank made it into this parking area behind these businesses here. This tank destroyed by loitering munition strike, this one destroyed by loitering munition strike, although this one moved out, and this one back here moved out, and fired through this building as they saw these Russian tanks moving. They saw the lead tank moving through this direction. The Russians saw them too and exchanged fire at about the same time, and although the Americans blew this house to pieces and damaged on the explosive reactive armor the T-72B3M, the T-72B3M that was hit turned and fired promptly and destroyed this tank immediately. This tank was destroyed by Russian armored infantry forces firing their Coronet man-portable anti-tank system into this tank, destroying it completely. These tanks in this column just had a turkey shoot with these lead vehicles. They destroyed this one offhand while these 2 went around. They were hit and destroyed. Again, these were hit by loitering munition strikes and destroyed. These Russian tanks, as these armored infantry forces were clearing buildings, as again, these tanks had moved here, they were now moving around here. By this point, these American forces had already been destroyed as Chinese artillery yet again hit this area with this parking lot behind it, as it was already hit in the first 30 minutes, as were these buildings on these blocks. At the opening of the map, this is happening. These areas are hit yet again, here as well, and destroying all the rest of Charlie Company, trying to flee the area this way and this way, while the rest of it was destroyed by Russian ground forces in the front and air power in the back. And Delta was destroyed by the PAP, using their very powerful vehicle capabilities from this platoon here, as well as mostly their dismounts with their very powerful HJ-08 anti-tank missiles, flamethrowers in the form of the Type 74 flamethrowers, and of course, rocket-propelled grenades like the Type 69, which was so mass-produced, it's unquantifiable, the numbers of mass production of these systems, and were still being mass-produced, and the Chinese artillery was simply debilitating and devastating on the American forces, as well as they also supported the Russians by destroying much of the headquarters elements of the Bravo company, which is the tank company. And as these tanks moved through the area, there was a brief exchange of fire between Russian and American tanks, although these tanks, again, were destroyed by the time they got here. And when they were moving through here, they destroyed this command tank, and this command tank tried to move around this building, but then they came around and destroyed them as the lead tank moved in this area, fired around the corner, destroying this tank that moved here to try to get out of the way when they were over here. So again, they had no ISR. The Americans had none. They moved as the artillery impacted and caused very minor damage behind these tanks, caused them to move. But then as the Russians moved down, they didn't know the Russians were coming until they saw them, and the Russians knew they were already here, and they fired first and destroyed these tanks, although these tanks tried to fire back. They managed to basically fire their coax weapons and their turret-based weapons, but they never got a shell onto them. That's why there's green, but there's no destruction of Russian armor. And they destroyed this command tank as well, before they then moved into this lot and took up position, effectively linking up with PAP forces who could easily see them from their positions on tops of the buildings and within these buildings across the way, as the PAP securing this area with Chinese missile strikes and airstrikes destroying the hotel and much of the vehicles, and artillery strikes assisting in this. The Russian and Chinese forces had captured the entire area as Russian armored infantry was clearing houses and apartment buildings and businesses as they had left their vehicles a bit further back, but received enormous loitering munition support, which destroyed armed reactionary civilians trying to hightail it out of this entire area. including down here being hit by Chinese CH-901As that were exceedingly fast and could easily catch up and destroy these vehicles, as they had been fired in a large amount at the opening of this campaign, and more were moving in the south against armed reactionary civilians, and others had already hit their targets from the first batch of 48 fired by the headquarters battalion of the People's Armed Police 43rd Brigade's headquarters battalion, who was on their CCP property with the command elements and regimental logistical elements of the 130th Artillery Regiment that were there with them as well to coordinate their activities even better by doing it in person, although they could have easily done it over radio and also through their combat data links. It was much more efficient to have command elements in the same room scheming and planning together effectively, as they could do it basically in the same room. And as these forces were rapidly overtaking the most powerful American combat elements in the Austin battlespace, the rest of the battle going on concurrently was full of activity in these opening hours, as the headquarters just to the north of this battle in Round Rock of the 1st to the 355th was being rapidly destroyed and overtaken by missile and artillery and ground-based forces. And also, the flanks were being cleared, including in Lago Vista, to capture intact the Rusty Allen Municipal Airport, as well as also combat immediately to the south and slightly east of there in Lakeway, as the combat engineers were moving through there. After a massive saturation by one of the firing batteries of the BM-21 Grads, having showered armed reactionary civilians with 122mm rockets, effectively annihilating them where they stood, as they didn't even know that they were about to be hit by rocket fire, and they were simply wiped out. They had no recourse, no chance whatsoever at all. And the four-post drone assisted in this targeting effort every bit as much as the quadcopter assets, and even, of course, the satellites assisting that were the Chinese military satellites and, of course, Russian military satellites as well, even some from smaller allies, as smaller allies of the coalition even had military satellites, although nowhere near as many as China, who had the most in the world, and Russia, who now had the second most because America had lost all of theirs. In the next video of this battle, in the Austin battle, of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines, the battle that occurred at the headquarters of the 1st of the 355th, a training battalion of the reserve component of the U.S. Army, was savagely attacked at the same time as the bivouac site in North Austin was brutally annihilated by the Russian Army, Air Force, or VVS as well, Chinese missile forces, and their People's Armed Police paramilitary shock forces, all at the same time. As this happened in tandem, as was Camp Maybury being hit heavily by missile and air strikes from the Su-34s of the Su-34 squadron, as a pair of Su-34s, along with Chinese and Russian tactical ballistic and cruise missile strikes, hit Camp Maybury hard and wiped out much of the command staff of the Army and Air National Guard forces of Texas. Although the actual commanders were high on the wanted list on the deck of cards for the state of Texas, as America was so vast, each and every state had its own deck of cards of most wanted individuals. They would be captured when the CAP building was taken by Russian combat engineer forces, who would move into the city upon moving across their pontoon bridge, which was a PMP pontoon bridge, which was a Russian pontoon bridge laid by their combat engineer forces as they would move in, seize the CAP building from the paramilitary elements that defended it, as well as the local security forces, and take all the high-value individuals captive. as the rest of their forces were smashing their way into the city from the west, while the Chinese were smashing their way in from the east and were committing brutal, heinous acts of devastation everywhere where their forces stepped foot in this battle. As the combat, again, like all the rest of the battles in this series, was of a brutal, unrestricted nature in terms of the level of barbarism that was employed against the local population. No quarter was given to it, essentially. Especially if they were willing to resist and willingly put their arms down, they were treated like total garbage. The only respect they were given was according to China's own version of something like a Bushido code that was rediscovered, where if they fought and were wounded fighting and then captured, they would be given much more respect than those who fought and then just willingly threw their weapons down. That was seen as disgraceful. And again, heinous acts would be committed by these forces as they had no regard whatsoever at all for the local population. This would become New China whether the people liked it or not. America had no recourse and no power to affect this outcome. All they could hope to do, and they would, was to never give up, go on fighting a long and drawn-out insurgency against these brutal occupation forces and tie them down, forcing them to expend ample quantities of money and resources to put down this resistance. Although the vast majority of the American population would be exterminated eventually as a result of this, with the Chinese and their allies losing comparatively few by comparison, as they would lose in the tens of thousands and the Americans would lose in the tens of millions of people. This long, drawn-out war would be the best thing that the American people could hope for, as their nation would fall and there was nothing they could do about it, because China was vastly more powerful than America, or any other nation for that matter. And Russia, right behind them, in terms of overall power on the world stage, was their ally and was helping them, as they also seen America as a wicked enemy that needed to be destroyed at all costs, because they had proven this during the Great European Proxy Conflict, as they showed their hand, they showed their intentions towards Russia. And instead of trying to make friendly with Russia, they made a mortal enemy out of Russia. And the Russians would never forget this. Now they saw America as the biggest threat to world peace, and that is why they joined the Chinese in their war of conquest and annihilation against this nation. More to come in the next video.